General Assembly. In addition, we're very grateful to have funding from Carroll EMC Foundation locally. And today, we spent some time at Warm Springs with our scholar, Dr. Winkler, and we learned about the REA and learned that Carroll EMC is part of the heritage of the Rural Electrification Authority. So it's very fitting that they provided funding for the Roosevelt exhibit. For those of you who are here for extra credit, we'll have sign-in sheets afterward. There's an evaluation form. We'd appreciate if you could fill that out. If you're interested in the Nelson Society, I'd like to ask the board of the Nelson Society to stand. We have a few of our members here. Dr. Ferland is here. So if you'll talk, Dr. Freer is here. If you'll talk to any of those or look for brochures, we'll gladly have you join us as a member. I think I've hit everything. I'd like to introduce a preeminent American scholar, Dr. John Ferland. He is president of the Nelson Foundation on Health Education.
Thank you, Lorraine. And I just, in addition to all of the thanks that Lorraine gave, I wanted to also thank the Organization of American Historians. Through them that Dr. Winkler is able to be here this evening. The Penelope Nelson Society is an organization that supports the library. We believe very much in the notion that the library is the hub of a college campus, and we want students to make the library part of their lifelong learning experience. We also try to reach out from academe across to the wider community and try to do that through talks by faculty members and through exhibits such as this. In a sense, our motto is something along the lines of what Thomas Jefferson said in 1813. He who receives an idea from me receives instruction himself without lessening mine, as he who lights his taper at mine receives light without darkening me. And so we try to spread light to the broader community through events such as this kind of exhibit. We're honored tonight to have Dr. Allan Winkler as our speaker. Dr. Winkler is a professor of history at Miami University of Ohio. He's been there since the mid-1980s. He taught at the University of Oregon. Before that, he received his college degrees from Harvard, Columbia University, and a PhD from Yale. He's the author of numerous books and has been sort of really eclectic in his writing. He's written on everything from Cold War America to Pete Seeger, the singer, but he's also written a number of books on Franklin Roosevelt and Franklin Roosevelt's time, including Franklin D. Roosevelt and the Making of Modern America and Homefront USA, America during World War II. So please join me in welcoming our speaker tonight, Dr. Allan Winkler.
Thank you very much, John and Lorraine. I spent a delightful day at the little White House in Warm Springs with them and with Lorraine's daughter, Jordan. I had spent in the past a good deal of time in Hyde Park, where the FDR homestead and library is. I've been to Campobello, where he had summered and where he was stricken with polio. I had never been to Warm Springs, and so for me, it was a treat. About 7 or 8 years ago, I don't know how to do that, no. Is that a little better? I can't tell. Okay. About 7 or 8 years ago, I published a small book about FDR, a biography that I had been wanting to write for most of my teaching career. And that meant that I got to live with FDR for the better part of several years, which for me was a treat. I had begun going to Hyde Park when I was a graduate student doing my doctorate. I had taken students to Hyde Park to work, both from Yale University when I taught there, and from Miami University when I was teaching, about 8 or 9 years ago. And for me, simply doing that was something that was important because I have always viewed Franklin Roosevelt as one of the dominant and most important and most influential figures in the 20th century. He was a man who basically saved the capitalist order in America at a time when it was under severe threat. He was somebody who refurbished the image of the presidency when it was under attack after Herbert Hoover's inability to do anything during the Great Depression. He was somebody who led Americans to begin. Simply work without speakers above you. Stand back for them a little bit. Let's work without it, it's fine. Can you hear me? He was somebody who basically led people to point towards Washington, which has become increasingly important in our lives with everything from Social Security to welfare issues and the like. He was committed to the notion that it was the role of government to help those who could not help themselves, and that has become a staple of the 20th century. And we debate back and forth in today's political world how far that should go, but it was nonetheless a very important step forward because there were a lot of people who couldn't help themselves. He presided over the Western effort in the greatest war of all time, the Second World War, and ultimately presided over the victory over the Axis powers, and we'll talk about that in a little while. It was a record that was not without black marks, to be sure. There were things that did not go well. There were things that were done that should not have been done, and we'll mention those as we continue over the course of the next 45 minutes or so. But at the same time, I would suggest that the world was a vastly better place as a result of what FDR had done. The stories about him are legion, and they range from the stories told by old soldiers who were with him in North Africa, where he was inspecting troops at one point after the invasion in 1942. And one soldier turned around and he saw the president and said, "Oh my God!" And Roosevelt just looked at him and said, "Just for one more term, son." That was the way some people viewed him. My graduate school advisor, my dissertation advisor, a man named John Blum, was a naval officer in the Pacific when Roosevelt died on April 12, 1945. And his reaction, like the reaction of so many people, and we heard some of these comments at Warm Springs today, was, "My God, who the hell is president?" He couldn't remember anybody else because Roosevelt had been president for more than 12 years. He at the time was 21, 22 years old and simply had no recollection at that point. My step-grandmother, my stepmother's mother, who lived in New York City until she died at the age of 92 about 10 years ago, lived in an apartment that was built by the International Ladies Garment Workers, a union. And that building was built only because FDR, through a variety of legislative activity, had made it possible for union organization to take place in America in the 1930s. There had been pitched battles in the 1920s, there had been efforts, but they were being squelched right and left. And the union movement, whatever its difficulties in today's order, the union movement came of age during that period of time. He also had the affection of people all over the country, and indeed in some ways all over the world, who felt that he understood them. He understood their problems. He understood what their needs were and how they could be helped. I was reminded of that once, this is about 35 years ago, when I was teaching in Helsinki, Finland. And the Finnish language is very difficult. I didn't learn very much. And my son at the time was 2 years old, going 2.5, going on 3. And he was in a Finnish daycare center, and he learned Finnish language. And once he came to me, we didn't have a television, but we had a radio. And he said, "Daddy, come, listen, the radio's talking to me." And I said, "What do you mean, David?" And he said, come. And so I went into the other room, and the radio was playing some kind of Mozart concerto or what have you. And I said, "So what's going on, David?"
And he said, just wait. And after a while, the music stopped and the announcer came on. And he rattled something off that I couldn't understand. You know, humanta peva, kapskum and elia viziko, whatever. But David understood it. And he said, see, he's talking to me. And that was the idea that millions of Americans had when they gathered around their radios for the fireside chats, or when they listened to FDR with his first inaugural. And it made a powerful, powerful impression. He was somebody. Here you see an image of him in one of the official portraits, married to Eleanor Roosevelt, who became as well known as he was, and we'll talk about her as we go on in a while. Somebody who had a devastating disease. That disease, of course, was polio. As I was growing up in the 1950s, I remember my mother being scared stiff of polio season when it came, because there was no vaccine in the early 1950s. And if you got polio, you could end up paralyzed from the neck down, from the waist down, who knows what it would attack. And I remember as a youngster once going to visit somebody who did have polio, seeing the iron lungs that were there for people who couldn't even breathe because they had lost the ability thanks to the dread virus. There's an iron lung at the little White House establishment where the pools are, and it's sort of fascinating to see. In this picture right here, you can't see it terribly well, but if you look, FDR has braces under his trousers because he could not walk without them. His legs basically did not work. In this picture here that I took this afternoon when we were at, what was it called? Dowell's Knob, wonderful overlook, shows FDR at a place that he loved near the Warm Springs area. This was the one place where he felt comfortable having the braces on the outside of his trousers because he didn't have to worry. Lots of people had come to Warm Springs like him who couldn't walk, couldn't do things. And those were important. He spent most of his life from the 1920s on in a wheelchair. There is one of them in Warm Springs. You can see another one in Hyde Park. The original wheelchairs were simply kitchen chairs that were attached to wheels, and that's what he was on. The most important point is that virtually nobody knew that he was paralyzed from the waist down. The press knew it, but there was an agreement not to take pictures of him that way, not to write about him. When he went to give a speech, as he did in 1924 and 1928 at the Democratic National Conventions, he had his braces on. He would be holding on to one of his sons, and he was able to get to the lectern that way comfortably. It was not seamless, to be sure. Every once in a while there might be an accident, but nonetheless people watched that and thought he was okay, thought he was able-bodied, thought he had the power, the force, the resilience to make things happen, and for all intents and purposes, he really did. During FDR's tenure, nobody talked about his polio. In Washington, D.C., not too many years ago, the government opened up an FDR memorial, quite different from the Jefferson Memorial or the Lincoln Memorial or the Washington Monument. It's a really lovely outdoor sculpture garden, and it did not contain this image, this statue, when it was first inaugurated, when it was opened. And Americans with disabilities began to petition for showing FDR in his wheelchair, because now in our day and age, it's become much more acceptable and common. We have the ability to get into buildings that we didn't have before. And it's ironic, but this was put in after the memorial was opened, and it simply reflects how we can now look at FDR with that disability and nonetheless accept him for the powerful and important political figure that he was. He was somebody who was jaunty, who was confident, who was, absolutely certain that he could deal with situations, even if they were complicated and even if they were troubling. I know it's not politically correct to show people smoking, but FDR did smoke, and there he is in one of my favorite pictures with the cigarette holder at that jaunty angle, simply conveying that sense of confidence that was so important. Let's talk a little bit about FDR and who he was. He came from a wealthy, old family. His father, James, had a wife who died. He had an older brother who was probably in his 30s when FDR was born. His father, even though he came from the moneyed class, was not quite like the Vanderbilt family. If you go to Hyde Park, it's really a lovely building that was his homestead, where the library is now. If you go a mile up the road, you come to the Vanderbilt mansion, which is ostentatious, ornate. It was sort of robber baron rich. The Roosevelts were not like that at all. Roosevelt himself came from his father James, who was about 52 when he was born in 1882. Roosevelt's mother Sarah was 26, so she was half the age of her husband. And this was their only child. The older brother Rosie was a grown-up and had children of his own who basically were companions as FDR grew up. He was something of a mama's boy. His mother didn't cut his hair until he was 6 years old. Dressed him in long dresses as if he were a little girl. He had his own pony. He had dogs at Hyde Park. He had an ice boat that he could take with a sail on it so he could go on the Hudson River when it froze. He came from a very comfortable class. He was homeschooled until in his early teenage years he was sent off to Groton, a prep school in Connecticut for people of his social class. And all of that was important. Groton wasn't easy. It was a rough transition to go there, but he did acceptably well. The head of that, Endicott Peabody, thought that he was a good student, a good kid. And in due course, he went off to Harvard, as many members of his family and class had done. His fifth cousin was none other than Theodore Roosevelt, TR, who was to be President of the United States in the early 20th century. A distant relation, but with the same name. And Franklin Roosevelt was always aware of what TR had done at Harvard and elsewhere, and at times patterned himself in that image because he wanted to follow in TR's footsteps. Theodore Roosevelt was a Republican. Franklin Roosevelt joined the Democratic Party, as had his father, and so there was that difference right there. At Harvard, he was a middling student, got C's, was much more concerned with managing and becoming president of the Harvard Crimson, the newspaper at Harvard at that time. Basically completed his coursework in 3 years and stayed on for a fourth year to deal with the Crimson in that capacity. While there, he met again his fifth cousin, Eleanor, who came from Theodore Roosevelt's side of the family. TR was a much closer relation to her. And they fell in love, and ultimately, before he graduated, Franklin proposed to her and asked her to marry him, and she agreed. Sarah Roosevelt, his mother, was very angry. She wanted to manage Franklin's life. She wanted to choose who he would marry. She wanted to tell him when it was the proper time and when it was not. But Roosevelt had a mind of his own, and he and Eleanor, in fact, were married. Sarah bought them a house in New York City, a brownstone, and they moved in there. She lived a few blocks away. Then she bought them another house, and she bought one for herself that was right next door. And she knocked down the wall between their two houses so that she could come and go as she wished, and that was simply the way it was. And this was kind of tough for Eleanor. She didn't really like that. She wasn't comfortable with her mother-in-law, but there was not a whole lot that she could do. Franklin became a lawyer, studied law at Columbia because he wanted to be in New York, began to practice, never completed law school, but passed the bar, as you could do back in those days, and was bored by the practice of the law at that time. Dreamed of politics, wanted to go into politics, and ended up doing what his fifth cousin Theodore had done, running for the New York State Legislature. Theodore Roosevelt had been in the Assembly, the lower house. Franklin Roosevelt ran for the state Senate, was elected. It was an upset victory. A Democrat had not been elected in his district for some time, but he was on his way with his political career. Round about that time, he supported Woodrow Wilson, who was running for president in 1912. And in return for that support, he was named to the position he wanted most of all, the same position that Theodore Roosevelt had held in 1898, Assistant Secretary of the Navy. And Franklin Roosevelt held that position for the next 8 years through World War I, traveled to Europe during the war because he wanted to see what combat was like. He was not an infantry soldier, but he was clearly in the middle of things and was proud of all of that. Came back, and because of his visibility, because he was a very good-looking man, because he had a good speaking voice that got better as he went on, he began eventually to run for other political office. In 1920, he ran for the vice presidency of the United States on the Democratic ticket, with James Cox of Ohio running for the presidency. And they lost badly. It was a Republican year. Warren G. Harding was elected, and Roosevelt retired from politics for a time. Well, things were going to happen, and we'll come to those in just a minute. But around about this time, two things went on, one personal and one medical. Eleanor basically had never much liked sex. She was, after 5 children, practicing birth control by abstinence. She had moved into a separate bedroom. Franklin was lonely. And Franklin became enamored of his wife's private secretary, a woman named Lucy Mercer. And over time, Lucy, who often took her meals with the family and was very close to the children and all of them, became closer and closer to Franklin, and a real affair began. And once when Franklin came back from Europe, ill with pneumonia, Eleanor came to help nurse him, and while she was doing that, and while he was ill, she discovered a packet of letters that were from Lucy that indicated what she had been afraid of, that an affair was taking place. And she was mortified, upset, angry, irritated. And the family had a kind of conference, and Sarah was there, and Roosevelt's political advisors were there, and he had dreamed of being president, but this could torpedo it right in there. And he asked Eleanor if she wanted a divorce. And he was prepared to give that to her, even though it might have ended his political career. But Louis Howe, political advisor, said no. Eventually, they made an agreement that he and Eleanor would remain married, but they never lived together, they never slept together for the remainder of their lives. They had separate bedrooms. If you visit Hyde Park, there is Franklin's bedroom here, Eleanor's bedroom here, Sarah's bedroom in the middle between the two of them. They were separate. And Eleanor wasn't really happy with that either. She said she was like an elephant. She could forgive, but she couldn't forget. And this hurt her for the remainder of her life. It had one very important effect. It made her realize that she needed to be her own person. She began to become a much more public personality. She began to speak out. She began to write in the newspapers. She began to travel for Franklin and became his eyes and ears when he needed that kind of assistance. And she became a tremendously well-known figure, not just in this country, but worldwide. The other thing that happened, early 1920s, was that when he was up at Campobello, his summer place, the Bay of Fundy, he had been sailing, he had taken a swim, he had visited a little Boy Scout camp nearby, and all of a sudden, he couldn't get up out of bed the next morning. Had a chill. There was something wrong. And it turned out that he had contracted polio. And they didn't know how serious it was going to be. It could have killed him. It could have paralyzed him from the neck down. They got him back to New York City. They massaged his legs as he was on the train going to New York. In fact, we now know that was the worst thing they could have done for the paralysis, but be that as it may. And the reality is that after that time, in spite of intense physical therapy, he never walked again. I have a colleague and friend, his name is Jim Tobin, historian, who is writing a book about FDR and polio right now, and we've talked about him. He's told stories about FDR at Hyde Park trying to get to the highway, which was a quarter mile away. It was a long driveway. And Roosevelt was walking with canes, trying to use the canes to take a step at a time with his braces on his legs, sometimes falling down, doing this for a couple of years. And eventually he had to realize that that wasn't going to work, that he was never going to walk normally. He did exercises. He had a tremendously strong upper body. You can see pictures at Warm Springs of what it was like. That was when he began to go to Warm Springs in 1924 because the warm water and mineral waters were good. It made it easier to let his legs move, and he enjoyed being able to do that with other people. But he understood at that point that he was never going to walk again. In 1924, he finally felt ready to go back into the political world. He went to the Democratic National Convention and he nominated Al Smith, whom he called the Happy Warrior, to be the Democratic nominee. Smith did not get the nomination that year, but FDR was back and people recognized that. In 1928, Al Smith did get a presidential nomination of the Democratic Party. At that point, Roosevelt took the nomination to be governor of New York, Smith's old position, and he won in a very hefty landslide. He was governor for the next 4 years, during which time the country fell into a terrible depression, and we'll talk about that in just a moment. And all of that led up to 1932, and I'll come back to that in a moment. Before we do that, let's talk about what Roosevelt was like. He has that confident grin on his face right there. He's driving a car that is equipped with hand control, so he can drive it himself around Hyde Park, around the Warm Springs area. He loved doing that. He was somebody who had a kind of confidence, who had a kind of serenity. There was a feeling that things were going to be okay. He conveyed that sense of equanimity to the rest of the country and the rest of the world, both during the Depression and during World War II. He was somebody who had, in fact, a superb speaking voice. And if you have heard the recording of his first inaugural, when he made the famous statement, the only thing we have to fear, and there's a pause, is fear itself, it sends shivers down your spine. When he told the country about the attack on Pearl Harbor and said, yesterday, December 7th, a date which will live in infamy, Japanese attacked us at Pearl Harbor, people understood what he was talking about, and that made a huge, huge difference. Above all, however, he was a politician, in the best sense of the word. And he had a marvelous sense of timing. He understood when it was time to act, when it was time to hold back, what he needed to do, when he needed to do it, and that made a huge difference. And there's a story that really reflects that political ability and that sense of timing. It was around about 1937, 1938, and the head of the Federal Reserve System was a Utah banker by the name of Mariner Eccles. And Eccles came to the Oval Office once, and he wanted FDR to do something. And he was ushered into the Oval Office, and FDR was listening to the radio. And he said, Mariner, sit down, there's a Wagner opera going on, and my favorite aria is coming up in just a moment. You've got to listen to this. And they sat down and listened to the Wagner opera for about 10 minutes. And then it was time for Eccles to be ushered out of the Oval Office. He didn't have a chance to say anything at all. He was kind of upset. So he came back the next week. And this time, he saw little dog Fowler, Roosevelt's Scotch Terrier. And Fowler was in the Oval Office. And then Eccles said, almost as if on cue, Fowler began purging himself on the rug, taking a poop. And FDR said, well, we got that, Mariner. We can't have Fowler doing that, so he called in the Secret Service, and they rubbed his nose in the poop. They got ammonia, and they cleaned up the rug. You know, it's a nice rug. And then it was time for Eccles to leave. And he was furious. But he finally understood that Roosevelt was not ready to deal with the issue that he wanted him to talk about at that point. And this was his way of simply putting him off, much as Lincoln would do it by telling dirty stories in the wonderful movie Lincoln, we saw a couple of weeks ago. And Roosevelt had that remarkable ability. Well, all right. 1932. The country is mired in the worst depression it has ever known. We worry about 8-9% unemployment. Happy when it goes down to 7%. In the last recession, it got up to about 11%. That's awful. I mean, in human terms, it's a terrible, terrible thing that people are unemployed and can't find work. During the Great Depression, 25% of the American people were unemployed, totally unemployed, Another 25% were underemployed. That meant they wanted work and might only get 5-10 hours a week, and that was all that they could do to make their families, healthy and whatever they wanted. It was a miserable time, and there were bread lines. There's that wonderful poster in the hallway showing somebody saying, I won't work, and he was standing there. Popular song of the day was "Brother, Can You Spare a Dime?" and all of that was really part of the larger picture. Herbert Hoover hadn't done anything, really, to end the Depression. His own political ideology indicated you should wait for things simply to happen, and he did, and they didn't happen. And Roosevelt won in a landslide. He won all but 6 states on the eastern seaboard: Connecticut, Pennsylvania, and the like, and New Hampshire, Vermont, Maine. Roosevelt also had Democratic majorities in both houses of Congress, and now he had to deal with the situation. So what did he do? Well, Roosevelt gave his wonderful first inaugural address. Immediately after that, he went back to the White House, and he had his advisors begin to draft a banking bill, because the banks in 38 different states, that's almost the entire country, were failing right and left. They failed if people didn't have confidence that the money they put in the bank was going to be available when they wanted to get it out. Now, banks don't keep all of your money when you put it in the bank. They lend it to other people. That's how they make their money. And if everybody wants your money at the same time, the banks can't do it. And they go bankrupt, and they have to close, and they never can reopen. And this is what was happening, because people were afraid, and they wanted to get the money out before it would be gone forever. And as they did that, it was a self-fulfilling prophecy. The banks failed. Roosevelt had his team put together a bill, the banking bill of 1933, which basically assigned federal conservators to go into the banks to decide which ones were strong enough to reopen, which were not, and they needed a little more time. Then he went on in a fireside chat to tell the public, I'm putting my money back in the bank, this is what we've done. If everybody will do that, we can make this system work again. And they believed him. They brought their money back, and the banking structure was saved. And then he pushed through a bill not too long thereafter establishing a federal deposit insurance corporation so that your money was insured, so that if this happened again, you would get something out of it. In the first 100 days, which we now talk about, he gave 15 major addresses. There were 15 pieces of legislation passed. He sent messages to Congress. He did an extraordinary number of things. Questions? If you look at this cartoon, I love it, and I showed it to my students. What happened was like an alphabet agency. You had the RFC, the NRA, the CCC, the PWA, the WPA, the NRA. And we're not going to try to talk about all of those things, but just talk very briefly about some of the major initiatives that he undertook. He knew that people were starving. He knew he had to do something to get them back to work. And to that end, he established a kind of program to provide relief to those who were starving. Money to go to the states that they could then give to people, and they did, and that helped. Could be a good bit of money, in fact. Other kinds of work relief programs developed the next year, in 1935 and thereafter, but there was always a conscious effort to do something to get people to be able to find enough money in their pockets to be able to buy bread or milk and feed their families. He recognized that farmers were having a rough time. They were producing more than they could sell. The more they produced, the lower the price went down, and that meant that they could not make a living. Overproduction was a problem. He pushed through something called the Agricultural Adjustment Administration, or ACT, which ended up paying farmers not to produce. In other words, they took land out of cultivation. They were paid money for doing that, and in return, the prices began to rise gently. He pushed through something called the National Recovery Act, establishing the National Industrial Recovery Administration, trying to get the economic system moving again. If people would sign on to do their part to get things moving again, and the like, they got to put a blue eagle in the window of their store or their barber shop or what have you, and that indicated that they were doing their part. And so there were all of these different kinds of things. Historians think about the New Deal in different ways. They think about the enormous wave of activity in 1933, and then there was another wave of activity in 1935. Sometimes they think about the 3 R's, relief, recovery, and reform, because there were reform measures that we'll talk about in just a moment. Sometimes they like to think in the ways that we just have about the major initiatives and what they were aimed at. Not everything was working. Not everything worked well. But Roosevelt won more seats in Congress in the midterm elections of 1934. It usually doesn't happen that way. And in 1935, he began to do some very important things. In 1935, he pushed through a measure called, I'll come back to that in a moment, Social Security. Social Security meant that the elderly, who did not have pension programs, because for the most part they didn't exist then, would get a check in each month and be able to retire with at least a measure of dignity. Terribly, terribly important. He also pushed something forth called the National Labor Relations Act, which allowed labor unions the right to organize, to bargain collectively, and told employers they had to bargain with the unions if they had a majority of the workers who wanted to do that. And that was a really good thing, too. In 1935, he pushed through something called the Works Progress Administration, the WPA. And that did things like paid people to dig holes and paid other people to fill them in. But it also paid people to paint pictures, because he said artists need to eat too, or to put on plays. There was a federal theater project that included people like Orson Welles. There was a federal writers project that my father participated in when he was out of school in the 1930s as a way of earning money to go back. A whole range of things that made a huge, huge difference. And all of that really was significant. Roosevelt was popular. Here he is in the image of St. George slaying the dragon, defeating fear, pushing towards recovery, and there are hundreds of cartoons like that you can see in the newspapers and magazines. It really gives some sense of what was going on. But not everybody was happy. This is one of my favorite cartoons. The caption below is, "Mother, Johnny wrote a naughty word." What was that naughty word? Roosevelt. And it was not a good thing. And he had opposition from people like Huey Long, governor of Louisiana and later senator, from Francis Townsend, who devised a kind of scheme for dealing with retired people that was a kind of precursor to what Social Security was, and others and the like. Well, all right. The question is, as we leave the 1930s for a while, at least domestically, how well did the New Deal work? And the answer is, it didn't work in economic terms. And the reason it didn't work can be understood with reference to the arguments of the economist, the great English economist, John Maynard Keynes. Back when Barack Obama was talking about a stimulus about 3.5 years ago, I was invited to Washington, D.C. to testify before a Senate committee. And my role was to talk about FDR, Keynes, and why a stimulus was important. And that's what I want to mention to you right now. Conventional wisdom at the time was that there was a business cycle. And sometimes you would be in depression. But all you needed to do was to wait until things got better, and automatically you would kind of come back to the top of the circle. People would go back to work, and everybody would live happily ever after. But Keynes said that's not really what happens in the real world. And he said that depression is equilibrium at a low level, and it's not going to get better unless you do something. So what do? Well, in the best of all worlds, private business will invest, and by spending money, it'll get the country out of depression. But if private business doesn't do that, government has to spend the money. It can build bridges, it can cut taxes, it can bury money and have people dig it up. It doesn't matter what they do. Public works projects are best of all because they put a lot of money in the economy quickly, and that's what he counseled. So the question is, how much money got spent during the Depression if enough at all? And the answer is, it wasn't enough. And that is because that there were things that were counterproductive. For example, Social Security was going to pay everybody a pension in 1942. That was the starting year when they would begin paying money out. And that theoretically would put money into the economy, and that would be a good thing. But in fact, they began taking money out of people's paychecks to pay for Social Security in 1935. So from 1935 on, in other words, it was acting directly opposite to what Keynes would have said. And there were other things that were not spending enough money or were alienating businessmen, like the Agricultural Act or Social Security or other kinds of things. Fundamentally, until World War II, the government was not spending in the ways that Keynes said it should have been. And so the economy limped along. Things got moderately better, but it was a slow recovery. And by 1940, we weren't there yet, and that was a real problem. Some people were angry. They said, get rid of FDR, but he got reelected in 36, and he got reelected in 1940, and their arguments didn't really help. Well, all right. In Europe, in Germany, at just about the time that Franklin Roosevelt was inaugurated in March of 1933, this man came to power at the end of January 1933, Adolf Hitler. And Hitler was angry about what had transpired during World War I, felt that Germany had been wrongly blamed for what was going on during the war and thereafter, believed that Jews were responsible for the German disaster, was an anti-Semite and talked about this openly in the memoir he wrote called Mein Kampf, The Struggle. And Hitler ended up doing all kinds of things. Forbidden to rearm by the Treaty of Versailles, he marched out of a disarmament conference and began to rearm Germany. He aligned himself with Italy, with Benito Mussolini, who had come to power in the 1920s and now dreamed of a kind of empire in Africa, in Abyssinia, now called Ethiopia. He formed an alliance with the Austro-Hungarian Empire, or the remnants of it, which he was forbidden to do by the Treaty of Versailles. And towards the end of the decade, he aligned himself with Hirohito, the Emperor of Japan, in what came to be called the tripartite Axis, the Axis powers. And what was happening was worrisome. Hitler dreamed of a kind of Germany that would take over the European continent, wanted parts of Czechoslovakia where Germans were living. When he got those, he took over the rest of Czechoslovakia, wanted Poland, and all of that was important. I wanted to show you this little map of Europe that somebody sent me out of the blue, and it's interactive, and as you move along you can see Europe as it stands. And Germany is taking things over. Here are the jackboots marching. Germany going on and on. Germany taking over country after country after country, moving into Poland in 1939, moving into the Balkans, moving into France, moving into the Nordic area, Scandinavia, moving towards the Low Countries, moving over there, heading towards Britain, and on and on and on. And as that was happening, Americans were becoming worried, and they were not happy. Americans were upset by what was going on, but also deadly sure that they did not want to go to war again. There was a sense of disillusionment after World War I, even though America had made the difference. The United States had only been in World War I for about a year and a half before it was over, although they tipped the tide in favor of the non-German powers. But this time, Americans were burned out, and they did not want to have to go to war. Roosevelt recognized how difficult the situation was. Roosevelt found himself allied with Winston Churchill on the left. There he is in the middle. This is at Yalta in 1945. Joseph Stalin on the right. Those became the big three after Hitler had invaded Russia after he had signed the non-aggression pact in any event. But these were the three powers facing Hitler, Mussolini, Hirohito, and the like. And it was tough during that time. And Roosevelt, I like this image even better, showing the three of them. Churchill, you can see his ruddy nose. Churchill liked his liquor. He used to drink habitually. At one point, so the story goes, Lady Astor looked at him and said, "Winston, you're drunk." He looked at her and he said, "Madam, you're ugly, and tomorrow morning I shall wake up sober." Think about it for a moment. Not nice. Joseph Stalin was ruthless, having liquidated millions of people in Gulag during the 1930s, kind of paranoid willingness to kill anybody who seemed opposed to him in any way. Each of these three powers, the big three powers, had different attitudes about the war, different aims in the war, different strategic imperatives, and working together was tough during this time. It was difficult. Initially, the Americans wanted to go across the English Channel in 1942. Winston Churchill said no, because a whole generation of English young men had been wiped out in the trench warfare. Stalin wanted an invasion across the Channel immediately, because 20 million Russians eventually died in the Eastern Front, and he wanted help in the West to take pressure off from what was going on there. So all of that was problematic, had to be negotiated. They met together at Casablanca, they met together at Tehran, they met together at Yalta, and eventually at Potsdam, and worked to try to make this effort possible. I'm fond of talking about World War II as a dinosaur. And the reason I like that image is because a dinosaur was the last episode, if you will, of a particular species. Big animals like that, we were never going to see them anymore after they were killed off or died off. World War II was the same way. We made tens, hundreds of thousands of airplanes, of ships, battleships, cruisers, landing tanks. We made millions upon millions of rounds of ammunition and the like. All of that was necessary to win the war, but with the advent of the atomic bomb, never again would warfare be the same. And never again would there be the kind of total mobilization that you saw during the war effort. Here you find plants making B-24s. Henry Ford established a mile-long plant, a mile-long assembly line in Willow Run outside of Detroit, stopped making Model A's, stopped making Ford motor cars. Government told him he had to stop, and began to make these things instead. And they rolled off the assembly line right and left. The entire economy was under control. There was one agency after another. There was a War Manpower Commission, War Production Board, Office of War Mobilization, and the list went on and on and on. And everything was controlled. Because materials were in short supply, in the end, there was rationing. So you needed not merely money, but you needed coupons to be able to get a pound of sugar, a pound of wheat, or whatever the case may have been. Men were drafted into the military. That meant that manpower was needed. Women were the obvious choice. And the government undertook a major campaign to persuade women that they could be attractive and still work in the factories, and that their role was needed. This was a cover of the Saturday Evening Post, painted by the artist Norman Rockwell. You see Rosie with her strong arm. She's got a riveting gun on her lap. Her foot, if you can see, is on a book, Mein Kampf, which was Hitler's own memoir. My students tell me it looks like she has a halo around her head, although it probably wasn't intended as that. And she was strong, and she was tough. And there were other images of Rosie as well, as you can see out in the exhibition in the main foyer. All of that worked. And then the government continued to need more effort. began to permit African Americans who were being discriminated against to move into positions they had not had before. At the beginning of the war, blacks could only join the Navy as messmen or cooks, could not join the Air Force, join the Army in segregated units, could not join the Marines, and were angry about that. A. Philip Randolph, a Union leader who was head of the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, called for a march on Washington in 1940 to take place in 1941. And Roosevelt was worried when it looked like 30, 40, 50, 70,000 people might show up in Washington, a southern town, and called Randolph to the White House to try to sweet-talk him out of having the march take place. And Randolph refused until Roosevelt agreed to sign an executive order creating a Fair Employment Practices Committee to try to ensure that there would be equality of hiring in the war effort. And he did. In 1940, even before the attack on Pearl Harbor that devastated America, Roosevelt called for increasing defense spending by a factor of 4. It's a huge amount of money, quadruple the amount of money being spent on defense. When he did that, almost overnight, full employment began to return. And that vindicated what John Maynard Keynes had been talking about. Spend money, return prosperity, and the country remained prosperous for the entire duration of the war and on into the 1950s and all the way up into the early 1960s, the greatest wave of prosperity we have ever known, vindicating Keynesian economics in important ways. Other things happened during the war. One of the black marks on the Roosevelt administration was the way it dealt with Hitler's final solution, his effort to kill 6 million Jews in the Holocaust. There was an anti-Semitic Assistant Secretary of State in the State Department named Breckinridge Long, who single-handedly basically bollocksed up every effort to ease the immigration quotas and permit more Jews to come to the United States. When finally the camps were liberated and we saw what had gone on, many people were sick. Historians have argued that that was one of the major failings of FDR's term in office. He interned Japanese Americans, a very small number in the country, 100,000. At least half of them were American citizens, having been born here, but sent to camps like Manzanar, Topaz, a whole range of others around western states, because people were afraid after Pearl Harbor that desperate things might have been done. In many ways, it was the greatest violation of civil liberties in the history of the United States. April 12th, 1945, Roosevelt went to Warm Springs, as he had occasionally during the war years. The amount of time he spent down there went down dramatically because of what he was having to do. In the cottage were Lucy Mercer Rutherford, married, widowed, whom he had sworn not to see again, but was brought by Anna, Roosevelt's daughter, without Eleanor knowing about it because she felt her father needed something to make him feel better. He was ill at the time. Everybody knew in the private entourage, his doctor and the immediate circle, that he was not healthy. He had tremendous high blood pressure. He was waiting for a disaster to happen, a stroke to occur. And on April 12, 1945, a cerebral hemorrhage killed him almost immediately. Here is Graham Jackson playing Going Home at Warm Springs and played for the president. Tears coming down his eyes in one of the famous photos. I took this picture with my iPhone at Warm Springs today because it really was powerful. And summed up for millions of people what Roosevelt meant. Well, what did Roosevelt mean? How did people deal with him by way of conclusion? Lots of people didn't understand it. Harold Ickes, who was his Secretary of the Interior for the entire duration of his presidency, said, I can't understand the man. Jesse Jones, who was part of the economic team early on, at one point said he was a lying son of a bitch. And then he said, but you can't help liking him. Oliver Wendell Holmes, having Supreme Court said, second-class intellect, first-class temperament, and that was true. But the comment that I like best came from a mill worker down in North Carolina who once said, Franklin Roosevelt is the only man who understands that my boss is a son of a bitch. That was important. I think on that note, that would be a good place to stop and to open it up for questions, comments, reactions, anything you would like to.
We have 7 or 8 minutes for questions and answers. If anybody has a question.
I have a question. After you and Roosevelt, Admiral Lacey was his wife. What role did he play in the final decision as far as military?
Alan, can you repeat the question?
The question was, what role did Admiral Leahy play in final decisions? Admiral Leahy was a top advisor, a top military man in the Navy. He was not happy, among other things, with what was happening in Poland at the very end of the war. There were 2 Polish governments in exile, one in Lublin, which the Soviet Union endorsed, one in London, which Churchill and Roosevelt favored. At the Yalta agreements, ultimately the Lublin government was taken as the basis for a new government that was supposed to be expanded. Leahy went to the president and said, this isn't a good thing. You have a whole lot of Poles in the United States who aren't happy. We should do more to protect democracy in Eastern Europe. And Roosevelt simply said, I can't help it, Bill. This is the best I can do at the time. In terms of military matters, I really don't know what role he played specifically, but he made his voice heard.
I'm curious what Roosevelt's relationship was with.
The question is, what was the nature of Roosevelt's relationship with Harry Truman, who became his vice president for the 4th term? Henry Wallace, a liberal, had been vice president in the 3rd term and was dropped from the ticket, and Truman took over. Truman only met Roosevelt twice in the period between the election and April 12, 1945. Only twice. Brief conversations. Was never briefed about the atomic bomb, didn't even know about it. Had gotten wind of it when he was on the Senate investigating committee, but tried to find out and was squelched by the Secretary of War who told him to lay off, and he did. Would Roosevelt have made any difference in the decision to use it had he stayed in power, stayed alive? I think not. I've written a book about the atomic age, and my argument would be that when the Manhattan Project got underway, the assumption was we would use the bomb whenever it was ready, as long as the war was going on. And I don't think Roosevelt ever doubted that or ever countermanded that idea. And that's exactly what happened when Truman became president. He never issued a conscious order to use the bombs. The only orders that are in the military records had to do with targeting decisions. And so I think that Roosevelt would have used it as well.
Americans in the service at that time are alive today because of that bomb. It would have been a carnage to have invaded Japan. Would you not agree with that? Is it wrong?
I think that there was a huge wave of relief when word came that the bomb had been used. I think that people have debated back and forth, not just the political issues. There's a very good book called Thank God for the Atomic Bomb by an author named Paul Fussell. I think you'd like it, actually. And his argument